everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in to this MEF webinar, the first of a new kind of webinar from us, which is on video. So we're all very excited about that. So we hope this is going to be the first of many of these MEF Digital Connects Digital webinars, where we're bringing together experts from across the ecosystem to discuss important topics. Today we're talking about digital consent, perfect digital consent, and whether that's a possibility or a myth. Now, obviously, as you know, we're hosting this session is the Mobile Ecosystem Forum, which is a global trade body founded in 2000 and headquartered in the UK. And the idea behind the MEF is to enable a healthy and sustainable mobile ecosystem. And obviously, over the decade and whatever it is, 17 years that we've been going, that remit has changed a little bit. And at the moment, we're very, very focused on issues around privacy, security, and trust, given how important the flow of data is to the digital economies of the future. So that's why the MEF launched in 2012 a consumer trust initiative with a working group which includes privacy experts, app developers, legal counsel, and along with technical and biz dev executives. We produced many research papers, consumer research papers and white papers. And the most recent one of those was on digital consent. And that's why we're hosting today's session. And I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by four experts that have helped us to create that paper. And they are Fabien Venries from Orange Group, and he's the head of privacy marketing there. We also have Emily Hancock, who's the VP of Legal at Evernote, Stuart Lacey, who's founder and CEO of Trunomi, and Michael Becker, who many of you may have known from his work with the Mobile Marketing Association over the last few years, and is currently finishing off a 10-year research paper on personal information economy. So he should know what he's talking about. And today he's representing Assurant as the head of identity and PIMS development strategy there. So that's a long intro. And it's still more because there's a bit of housekeeping to go. So just to let everybody know who's tuning in today, this broadcast is being recorded. It will last for roughly an hour. We'll have a discussion with the panelists first, and then we'll take questions. If you want to ask questions, please find the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and address your questions to all panelists, and I will moderate those, and any we don't get time for, we'll answer offline after the session. So I think that's it, and I think we can start with the discussion now. So I actually was lucky enough to write the white paper that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, and it's actually a pretty complex topic, consent. But to kick it off in a very simple fashion, let's sort of start at the fundamentals. So really, I just want to find out what the best practices are today around consent in terms of how you present consent, what you ask for and how you ask for it. So I'm going to ask Emily first, because she's running a looking after a consumer-facing company that's very much at the sharp end of this. So Emily, maybe I can ask you from your experience, what's the best way to present and define consent for your consumers?
Sure, thanks. There's a couple different ways to do it, and I think it depends on what the consumers are expecting. And I think that's one of the themes that we'll probably be talking about throughout this discussion is reasonable expectations. What good consent looks like for us at Evernote, and I'm speaking for myself, not on behalf of the company, but I'll talk about our experience at Evernote, is to make sure people understand what we're doing with their data. So clear description of what we're collecting and how we're using it and how we're disclosing it. And unfortunately, right now, there isn't a great way to do that other than in the privacy policy, which I know not many people read. So we try to talk about the data collection, the data disclosure practices in other ways. So being transparent through blog posts, through user forums, and in communications with our users, and trying to help users understand what we're about generally so that their expectations are set for what we're doing with their data. And then what we've done with our most recent privacy policy, which we launched just in July, was that we said, we're going to do all the things that you expect us to do with your data to make you more productive. In addition, there are other things we may be able to do with machine learning or additional data science on your information to help you be more productive, not to help us do anything with your data, but to help you, the user, be more productive. And so what we did there is we said, if we need human eyes to actually look at your data in order to train the algorithms and train the machine learning, in that situation, we're going to ask you explicitly for your consent. And we adopted a model where we said, no human beings are going to be looking at your data. We're going to be parsing your data in ways that will make you more productive and in ways that you expect based on our history with you and our statements and our privacy policy. And then if we need to go further and do more to help you with a customer support issue or to do some additional machine learning where human eyes need to look at your data, then in those cases, we're going to ask you for explicit consent. Now, that begs a good question for what good explicit consent looks like. And we haven't gotten to a point where we've actually needed to ask for explicit consent. But what we're envisioning is in time, in context, and an explanation of what we need to look at and for how long. So consent for anything beyond what you would expect would be time bound, and we would explicitly talk about what we need to do. Now, the challenge is going to be how to figure out how to do that on a little screen for our mobile users, but that's the vision of what good consent would look like.
Okay. I mean, we talked before about Evernote having a few issues around this in the past. I know you won't thank me for bringing these up, but it just goes to show that even the best intention can be misconstrued by consumers, and that's just reminds us all of how important presentation is and how difficult it is. Can you sort of speak to that a little bit, Emily?
Sure. Well, and what we found out when we tried to launch a new privacy policy in December 2016, and at that point, what we were trying to do is explain to people that we were going to do the things that they expected of us, and from time to time, people might need to look at their data in order for us to do that, but that our users would be able to opt out. Unfortunately, the way we communicated it was not ideal. And we had a couple early journalists / bloggers who picked up what we said and misconstrued it to think that we were going to be reading people's notes just all over the place, which is certainly not true and not what we've set forth in our 3 laws of data protection. And what we learned from that is, things that now in hindsight seem very obvious, which is that users want to feel like we're respecting their data. They want to be treated with respect. They don't want to be surprised. And they want transparency. But in being transparent, you need to figure out how to be clear and accurate and and not scary. So it's a fine line, and you have to have some really good in-house people to help you write those things, which fortunately we now have. And the other big lesson that I think we learned is when you're looking at consent models, it's very important to get customer feedback early on, to test what you're thinking of doing, and to talk to regulators, to other experts in the field, and really get a sense for, we're thinking of doing this, and in our own echo chamber of our own company, that sounds like a great idea, and that sounds like the right thing to do. But is it? Because we need to get outside the echo chamber and test our assumptions. And so when we relaunched our privacy policy in July, we spent basically 6 months doing that, talking to customers, talking to experts, testing our assumptions. And I think where we ended up is a much better place both for us and for our users, certainly, because I think now we have a much better set of, again, what reasonable expectations are and how we uphold those for our users and how we respect those for our users.
Okay, thank you. Now, Stuart, you're working with multiple companies and brands around consent policy, and your company works in a way to sort of standardize and automate consent. So maybe you've got a good view on the best way to present this, and also how companies can possibly use technical solutions to help them with that. Maybe you could explain a little bit about how you see that question.
Sure, thank you very much. I certainly think Emily's comments are well received. And I would certainly say when we're dealing with an end consumer, and not all consent actually involves an end consumer. And so meaningful consent, the broader topic, certainly must also envisage scenarios where we're dealing with B2B scenarios, for example, very large conglomerates that might have 500 brands that are trying to share data across brands and envelopes. Under the new EU data privacy laws, not everything has to be actually involving a human being. There might be data controller or automated processes that are running. So at Trunomi, what we see as meaningful consent is, in the most simplistic form, is the ability to capture, using our certificate process, effectively, what am I sharing, with who, for what reason, and for how long, under what context, and then using that certificate process to create rights, which can now be shared across a multitude of enterprise requirements using business logic. If you take it at that simplistic level, certainly those consents can be utilized, managed, and granted to the end customer, but equally they can be empowered across organizations. And we know that large organizations, especially complex financials, insurers, healthcare, have multiple verticals often within them or operating across a subset of industries. And so the consent use cases that become meaningfully important echo across those lenses, not just always directly to the end customer. Now, with the end customer, I think it's critical that you have a user experience which is additive and positive to their overall understanding of how consent is being asked for and granted. In our view, tools such as AI and elsewhere can be helpful, but I think part of it needs to be understood that consent is not just around trying to tick T's and C's and privacy policies. Rather, we see it as a change in the relationship between an organization and their customer, one where there's trust and transparency and understanding as to how the customer's data is being used. Our system's important, therefore, because it can actually surface and visualize via the certificate exactly what data is being used and permit then the customer, if they're exposed to something like general data protection regulation, to actually look at their data, change or update their data, provide data portability and all the other rights which are attached, therefore, under that regulation. And so when you expose the data you have on a customer and you change that relationship, we have ROI that have proved that you get a more engaged customer, a better personalized service, you get better retention, higher rates of conversion, and better NPS. And so whilst there's a lot of reg that is a driver, we actually believe it's good business practice now to focus on how we can consent and change trust and transparency in data usage. And our system is focused on that, not just the consumer level, but across B2B and organizational level as well.
Well, thank you for bringing up regulation. Clearly that we're going to be talking about that a little bit later because it's a very big part of this conversation. But just to come back to you, Stuart, you talk about, we all talk about private personal data as if it's easy to define what personal data is. And historically, maybe it has been because it's your bank account and your name and your address and so on. But now it's a little bit more complicated. It can be your location history or your browsing history, or it really depends on how an algorithm combines the various assets that you've left, data assets you've left behind you. So maybe you can just talk a little bit about how you get around some of those nuances.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And in different jurisdictions and under different lenses, companies might either apply legitimate interest and say that we believe the data we have we legitimately need and thus don't need consent, and or they might define what is or what is not personal differently. Equally, one element in and of itself might not be personal, but when combined with 2 or 3 other ones could become identifiable and thus it could be addressed as personal. So to say it's easy is not an easy thing to say. It's complex. However, with that said, we think there are probably 2 relatively vanilla approaches which people should use as a benchmark to proceed. The first of that is that I honestly believe that whether legitimate or consent, based either under informed requirement, companies are now starting to look to actually get permission across the entirety of the spectrum. We talk that the tachometer, like on a car where you redline. If you determine in your company you think you redline at 8,000 RPM and everything above that you have to get consent, everything below it's legitimate, What if the regulator determines that maybe your red line was 6? And so that's an arbitrary area, number one. And number two, if you're only putting operationalized consent around the people you think have to have it, you cannot offer any of the back-end rights to them, to the other 75% that you didn't do it to. And so you need to look at this as an end-to-end approach, not just a capture and tick the box. To that extent, if you're therefore looking at the full spectrum, as answer number one, you de-risk yourself and then you support your customer a very open and transparent view across the entirety of that lens. Secondarily, you need to look to your supplier relationships and any third parties you're working with to try and determine where you have exposures there. Now, I don't want to make a big plug for the consultancies, but certainly if you don't have the experience internally, there is room to have either assessments done or work done. And so companies that thrive in this market are also around the consultancy side of the business, but we don't practice that. We're pure technologists, and our goal is to give you tools that are easy, secure, and very, very user-friendly that can help kind of solve the technical aspects around most of the requirement. Okay,
so Michael, you've spent a long time thinking about these issues, and from an academic as well as a business point of view. I'll just sort of bring you around to that last question, which is, how do we actually define private data, given how AI, machine learning, algorithms are changing? You know, what we can do with the data trail that people leave behind. How do we define it? And then, given that it's quite complex and nuanced, how do we ask people permission to use it if we're not even really sure exactly what it is?
Yeah, it's interesting. I really liked Emily's points that she was raising before, is that when we look at the way and the relationship that people have with companies, we have to recognize and realize that, you know, every human endeavor is based on effective communication. It's the quote from my former business partner, Paul Burney, and I've really appreciated that. It's all situational, and we need to understand that and start with that idea. So it's about effective communication. It's about being transparent. It's about being true to your intents, and really starting with that basis. Then as you start, we think, and as Stuart talked about this as well in terms of context and the distinction between having a direct relationship with an individual as a brand such as Evernote, or having a company that has relationships across many brands, across many institutions. And that situation is very different. One of the challenges and one of the core tenets of this idea of consent is this idea of informed consent or explicit consent or implicit consent. And one of the challenges that, and up until this point, you know, pretty much all of society has really been around this way and basis of informed consent. You say yes, and then therefore I'll do Y. In other words, our models have been based on a causal model, a causal framework. If then that. And that's the way everything has worked all the way up until about 6 years ago. And then about 6 years ago, we started to switch to a correlation-based model. And in a correlation-based model, the concept of informed gets really murky, because when you start combining data sets and you start interacting across the different programs, we have to ask ourselves, to what extent can someone be informed? And can the organization even be informed when the algorithm is making decisions based on other ideas? So I think there's going to be some really interesting dialogues that have to go around this idea. What does it mean to have informed consent, and where do we go? I think the other thing that we need to be careful of in industry, and Stuart alluded to this as well, in that there are regional and situational differences in expectations of people. And coming from industry, we get really comfortable, or we assume knowledge. But there's still a vast majority of people out there in the market that don't necessarily understand that companies are amassing multiple pieces of data to create insights and to create algorithms and to create predictive scoring of us as individuals, so that they in fact can legitimately better serve us. But and again, as Emily said, if you're not careful, that can be really scary if you're not aware of what's going on. And I think we're in an interesting situation in society right now where some of this can be perceived as magic, even though it's just technology. So one of the things I think we need to do as an industry is start thinking about and really over-communicating, being very clear and very concise, being very consistent with that communication, being sensitive and having empathy for the marketplace that's out there for where it's going on. Because it's not just the value that I get from these services, and done right, as Stuart and Emily have both said, done right, there's tremendous value, and people absolutely want to engage, and they have no problem sharing their data. But done wrong, it can create a tremendous number of externalities and risks that ultimately the burden of which are put on the individual, not necessarily the individual corporation or industry. And so that's the balance that we need to be starting to figure out as we go through this process. And I just, again, I want to emphasize this point. We all kind of generally understand what we're talking about. The average person in the market absolutely does not, and nor should they. They have no exposure to this. They have no understanding. They're not necessarily technologists. They're looking for tools that make their lives more convenient, more efficient, and enriches them and makes them happy. And that's where we need to be focusing on, is this idea of really understanding the fact that privacy and consent is not a binary moment. It is a process, and it is a process that changes over time with the situational context. And that can be very difficult for companies, but that's something that we're facing today. So to answer your long story short to your question about an algorithm, the models have significantly changed, and the basic tenets and frameworks that we've developed have changed. And so I encourage every company, when they're looking at this idea of consent or an opt-in or permission or any number of different areas, is you actually look at it through 4 independent and interdependent lenses. And those 4 lenses are technology, as Stuart has been talking about. Another lens is the legal and regulatory, which has already been brought up for this in this discussion. The other lens is the expectation and experience of the individual, the overall experience. And then finally, one is just like, what's the moral thing to do? There might not be a rule for it, but based on the society, there is a moral lens. And I think you need to look at the interdependence between those 4 pillars of technology, experience, legality, and morality, and then look at that within that context as it's appropriate with the relationship that you're having with that individual.
And Michael, given that you talked about the fact that among the people involved in the industry that we're aware of these issues, but maybe the public aren't so aware of them, how do you get past the sort of idea of consent fatigue or apathy, whereby you do your best to present consent forms and permission forms, and they're just disregarded by people? They're regarded as a nuisance. How do you get past that?
Well, I think Emily hit the nail down. It really addressed it appropriately. Is a lot of communication, setting what your intentions are, interacting with the customer and the audience in a good way, being, not ignoring what the behavior is. If we were to read every single privacy policy that we say yes to, it would take roughly every year. It would take roughly 75 days to 80 days every year to read every privacy policy we say yes to. So to that extension, know that you need to bring up the higher level principles to the individual and just say, look, this is our intention. This is the service that we're providing you. This is what we're going to do with this data. I mean, Alan Weston defined this when he defined privacy back in 1968, that privacy is really the ability for an individual to have know the who, what, when, and where of how my information is being used and how my private self is being used. And every company needs to kind of fall back to that and really have empathy for that individual and to the extent that they're having that relationship with them. But Stuart raises a really important point. When you're looking at multi-conglomerate companies that have tens, if not hundreds of brands, this idea of a blanket consent across all of them, or a narrow consent across some of for a specific use and purpose, the brand's going to look for its own internal efficiencies, but at the same time, they need to balance their desire to have an efficient internal process with the needs of serving the individual. And I really think that fundamental tenet of serving the individual is going to establish a new basis of industrial competition by 2020. And that we're entering into a market where we're going to have to start learning how do we actually serve people at scale on their terms, not necessarily ours, and their expectation of the situational context.
Well, obviously that what you've just alluded to, the idea of a kind of genuinely personal data economy, we'll definitely come back to that, because that's a fascinating angle on this whole conversation. I want to bring Fabien in now. We just still talking really about the UX and some of the design processes around consent. Orange has done quite a lot of work on privacy issues. You have a dashboard and so on. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about what you've done and what you've learned about consumer behavior and consent from your projects.
Hello. Hi all. I hope you hear me well, because
Yeah,
my
we can hear you
iPhone
fine.
fine, in fact. So first, a comment regarding the chat. There was a comment regarding the fatigue, and clearly it's the cookie consent is an example of a bad consent that appeared during the last 2-3 years. And what we see is that instead of or at least it educated a little bit the market on the usage of personal data, but at the end we see that nobody is not reading it. So it's clearly not the way it has to be done. On the UX and on the design itself, I would say that I agree with the fact that first he has to be the consent has to be really personalized and targeted, and has to explain exactly what is concerned by the consent. And because the consent is always a break in the user experience, is always a break in order to access a service for the end user, and it's clearly there is clearly less value in protecting your data when you're a user than the value of accessing immediately a service. And that's the dilemma we have to tackle with the consent problem, and that's why sometimes we can I think we can consider that the regulator has good ideas, but at the end it's putting everything that is required in a consent screen is very difficult, and very difficult to understand from the end user point of view, particularly because clearly it does not have so much time to spend to read it. So we have, in fact, Orange is an aggregation of several affiliates, several operating companies around Europe and also world, in Africa. And clearly the way consent are handled is different from one country to another. But in fact, the behavior of customer regarding this consent is always almost the same. It's to find the close button. And this is something that we can see sometimes is as soon as you put a cross to close the window, if you have a cross to close the window, if you have yes or no, people will have a tendency to close the window. In fact, that means that they don't want to read it, they don't want to understand what is in the consent, they just want to get rid of this step. So first, do not put cross on your consent window if you want the user at least to try thinking about what is really what does that mean, this consent. And in terms of consent and of opt-in, let's say, and of opt-out, I think we are really considering the two parts of the consent. It's really the problem is really to find the correct mix between the opt-in screen, let's say, and the dashboard or opt-out screen. Some people call him opt-out, so it depends on. But at least what we believe is that in the consent screen, it has we have to keep it very simple, very straightforward. For sure, really showing the benefits and the usage benefits, and all the options must be easily accessible, but at another stage, let's say. So we have to show to the user that he will agree some elements at one time during the consent, but he can always go to the dashboard or setting a website where we'll be able to find everything and find the information he needs. And so for sure, you have also a problem of morality, and it's because for the marketing, and particularly for the direct marketing, the question is how to maximize opt-in. It's clearly how to have the maximum number of people in the database. But at the end, we see that an opt-in that is not understood leads also to less performance in terms of direct marketing, and also to complaints or to issues later on. So as soon as we really show the user that and that we put this clear and fair explanation to the end user, we can really build something that is better for the end user and the company itself.
Yeah. So the lesson seems to be don't put a cross on your privacy policies. But obviously, as you indicated there, Fabien, sometimes regulators mandate certain practices or advise certain practices. I know, Emily, I think you've got quite strong feelings on how the regulators can, with the best of intentions, sometimes make the user experience quite difficult.
Well, yeah, I don't know if it's strong feelings, but I think, one of the things that I guess in the context of the United States anyway, is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, where the law requires us internet service providers to get parental consent if you're going to process the data of children under the age of 13. And it's a fantastic concept, and nobody disagrees with the idea of protecting children's data. But the way in which the consent has been set up, it ends up being more form over substance in some ways, because of the way that then a lot of companies start saying, well, our service is not geared towards children under the age of 13. And so it drives kids underground, so to speak, because then they learn that they're supposed to lie about their ages in order to use certain products. And it's not really effective in protecting children's privacy. And so to the same token, what I'm a little bit concerned about is, and I think, Michael brought this up and Fabien mentioned as well, that, people are going to get really tired of clicking through consent boxes. And what they're going to miss is, the way they click through privacy policies now, they're not really reading them. And as far as we can tell, anecdotally anyway, they're not really reading them. And so they're like, yeah, I know. We're going to have to give our consent to this. Okay, fine. And then when it might really matter, when you're doing something that maybe is not totally consistent with expectations, then it's the boy who cried wolf scenario. They're so used to just saying, okay, I'm going to click through and say consent because I want to be able to get on with my day and use this product. They're not going to pay attention the one time it might matter when a company is trying to do something that may not be within their expectations. And so then if they click through automatically and just say, sure, yeah, that's fine, and they don't even really read what it is, no matter how well you try to craft that message, how kind of in front of the user you try to put it, and no X tick box to collapse a consent, then they'll be surprised later on because they'll be like, well, I didn't read that. I didn't know that's what I was consenting to. And so I worry that in trying to protect users' information, we're going to end up getting users desensitized too much. And so when it really matters that we want to make sure we get consent, it's not going to be as effective anymore because people are just going to like, yeah, I guess I have to consent, whatever, because I want to use this product. So I don't know if I have a perfect solution for that other than to continue to try to do things in context and explicitly as possible, or with as much information as possible and transparency. But I do really worry about that we've kind of set the industry up for failure a little bit with these rules.
Well, and to follow up on that, Emily, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think one of the biggest challenges is because we have created somewhat of a fatigue, and actually this is an old story. And if we take a step back, this idea of us as industry needing to learn about the people to effectively be able to serve them is not something new in society. And in fact, Cicero told us this back in 80 BC. If you want to persuade me, you must think my thoughts, feel my feelings, and speak my words. And the way we're going about creating that empathy and insight and understanding is through the pulling together of data. The challenge, though, in this society, though, is because in this digital world we can make rapid change. As far back as 2010, there was a UK gaming company called GameStation, and I don't know if you remember this case, but they for a 24-hour period they changed their privacy policy, and they effectively put notice, but people didn't read the change. And on that day, 7,500 people, when they bought their video game, also gave up their internal soul. They put in the privacy policy terms that by buying this game today, we now own your eternal soul for all of existence. You know, and they did it kind of as a game to see how many people would actually do it. And a lot of people did. But, and that was more of a joke. But what happens in a situation where it's not a joke and it actually is commercially binding? And, you know, and those are the things that we need to be concerned with. And on your, you know, and going back to the point I made earlier, Fabien was right in that ultimately it's about what is the most effective user experience. And just to reiterate the four core pillars or independent, interdependent pillars that I would encourage everybody to think about. It's the technology question for sure. The moral question, it's the economic one. That's the pillar I didn't bring up before. And the fourth one is the legal and regulatory one. And to understand what's happening with the legal and regulatory, I'd really encourage everybody to think about it in this kind of a triangular view, or what I call the astrophysics problem of personal data in terms of the three body problem. And astrophysics is the three body problem of when you have two suns and a planet orientating with themselves, understanding the gravitational implications of those three, you know, celestial bodies against each other is like crazy hard math. In our world, the three body problem is on one ideology is one of open data. And the ideology says that all of the data that can be amassed together in kind of a big data concept is good for society and used appropriately, as Cisco predicted back in 2013. That will create $19 trillion in net economic value for society. If we amass this data together, we'll create more efficiencies, more effectiveness, create more value, enrich and delight people. And that's one ideology. On the other extreme, you have an ideology of the digital sovereign individual. And in that ideology, the individual, personal data is a human right. The individual has a right to control and manage all of that. They have the ultimate extreme of being able to have, at every step along the way, giving consent. And again, taking to those extremes, both kind of fail. In the open data model, the user doesn't really have a lot of free will or choice or control. And to the extreme on the digital sovereign model, nearly impossible for the industry to scale to be able to effectively serve the industry. And then the third ideology is there what we'll call the social engineering model, where we're mixing those two open data and ideology model and digital sovereignty models to use data to influence social behavior and the type of society that we want to create. And so when we look at society and this problem, we need to look at it from those kind of four core tenet pillars and this three body problem of the regulatory issues. And that's the challenge, is that our regulators are trying to, you know, really deal with a really, you know, astrophysics level on dynamics problem when it comes to engaging and interacting with society. And it's gonna take us time.
Yeah, Michael, I'll try and keep this to 1 minute, but just quickly on the reg question. And, you know, we're an operation that has offices in London. We have operations in US. We're working right now, starting some Singapore stuff. And, you know, if we were to take all the acronyms of all the laws and all the different countries, try and reconcile them, it's not going to work, right? What we are seeing, though, is a heading towards some level of normalization globally ex-US. I'm not pointing the finger at the US, but the reality is with 50 states and everything else, it's going to be very complex for anything to come out that is completely homogeneous. But with that said, the GDPR, as it's expressed across Europe, appears to be quite similar in ways that Canada, Australia, Mexico, Brazil, Singapore are all kind of aspiring towards. And I think what's really interesting is rather than hammering too much in any one reg, we continue with all the people we talk to ask them to focus on the benefits of trust and transparency in data usage, and rather looking to the ways that this can be used positively. And we've actually found many, many companies that aren't even regulated starting to try and look about how they can meaningfully use consent and trust and transparency in the usage. And so, although reg's a huge driver, you know, people would be fairly balanced to say that I wouldn't know even which reg to start with or which reg this falls under, and then some regs actually argue with each other.
Thanks for that, Stuart. Just to say for the viewers, just to remind you to use the chat feature to pose any questions so that I don't have to keep doing it for the panelists. I just wanted to follow up on something Michael brought up, which is the idea around like personal sovereignty approach to the data question, and specifically around this sort of idea that we can all have our own range of consents. We don't need to have a one-size-fits-all consent. I just wonder, is this is this feasible? Will it be, is it feasible now? Will it be feasible in the future for every one of your customers, whether that's in a B2B environment or a B2C environment, to have their own consent and permissions? Maybe, Fabien, we haven't heard too much from you. Maybe you could give us your thoughts.
I don't get exactly the question. Do you mean if we can really have the full granularity of consent for?
Exactly.
For sure, we cannot really, at least in our case, we cannot really tune services to manage all kind of settings that the user will have. So for sure, today it's more black or white than with a wide range of granularity, depending on if you accept to give your location, if you accept to give your email or phone number or stuff like that. So having this, having that kind of way to differentiate, and according to it, adapt the service, it's really difficult, technically difficult, I think. What I like more is the concept of maybe defining groups of or defining your habits in terms of consent based on your usage and on also, why not, a community who have the same sensitivity like you, and it's called it was a study from an institute of technology. It was called the Privacy Assistant, based on the fact that they analyze the sort of profiles of users. And they determine, I don't know, 10 categories, for example, of profiles, and you fit in one of these categories, those category, and then it will apply automatically the settings for you for the next consent. So it will avoid you each time to find the right box, to understand, etc. So you have to rely on this kind of tool. Because if this tool is not correctly done, it can open also breaches. But at the end, it's a way to automatize a little bit the consent, because I think that at the end, I don't know, without automatization, how you will handle it. So it can automatize your consent based on your friends, on your social network, on a particular category of the way you want to interact with your data. So if you are very protective, you will put all the flags to no. If you are quite open, or if you consider more the value of service, you will put everything to yes. So it's more the kind of approach I feel can work in the future. But for sure, for us as companies, being able to handle all settings is very complex.
So Tim, to jump in on that, to a certain extent, I already think it exists. I mean, Emily already has it. You know, using the Evernote tool, I have sovereignty over my data. I can pick and choose where it's at. Or TripIt, there's good examples of TripIt has it, or we see that carriers have it, or there are some research panels that actually pay me for the data. So there are pockets of this already happening in industry at all four of the pillars, either being a moral one, a technical one, a legal and regulatory one, or economic one. The question is not going to be done as individualized pockets, but how do we actually do it systematically at scale across industry, and then therefore across industries? And that's going to happen, and it will in fact take time. But again, I think we can see insights from exactly what Emily's doing, and maybe she can react a little bit as well.
Yeah, I have to unmute myself first. Yeah, I mean, I think it is entirely possible to have different buckets, and I mean, there is one thing I worry about with that. So, I mean, I think it's important to give users ownership over their data, and to give them the rights to control, you know, how long their data is stored and what you do with it to an extent. And I think the other thing, though, that I do worry about is whether levels of consent get tied to payment. So the value exchange for a lot of the services out there that are free services is you give us your data, and in exchange you have free email, or you have free social media, right? But what if you pay us and then maybe you don't see as many ads, or maybe we don't collect as much log data about you or analytics data about you? And so that is one thing that I do worry about, that ends up being kind of a social stratification issue when we come to allowing different levels of consent. So that would be one model that I hope we don't end up seeing. And another model could be that you offer different levels of consent for different types of data, and you give users a little bit more control over the most sensitive data, and then maybe they have a little less control over data that generally is publicly accessible, for example. So I mean, I think there's ways to play around with it. I think we're going to see companies playing with it, and I don't mean without thought and without care, but testing different methods as we go through the next couple of years here and figure out what consent can mean and look like.
Yeah, I think, Emily, whilst I acknowledge your point, I think negative payment, i.e. pay to not, is probably not the attractive model that I think about when we see the opportunities around the information economy of personal data. It's rather the huge efficiency gains by large firms that are paying extensively right now for other inefficient processes, and you defraying their costs or having efficiency gains where your data actually becomes an asset class. And we've already tested that live with people, and it is actually a usable framework. But I think rather than value at this point, if we jump back just very quickly to the prior comment, I think the approach to successfully doing this at scale, and I can comment because we're actually doing it, but more importantly, is around a decentralized and distributed approach with federated access. And what we mean by that is we know we don't want to centralize the data. Just ask Equifax or anyone else. We're not going to take everyone's data and put it in one place and then allow them to use it. Data minimization and security will require that your data sets are in lots of locations with the correct amount of utility at all those places. And you, as the data owner or subject matter, have a lens across all of it based on a permissions framework. And then what we can do with that permissions framework, which is federated across multiple access, means that we now have either a registry of consent or an index or a stock exchange of consent, if you will. And that is the way in which we can have global, multi-vertical, multi-instrument, multi-data type consent and permissions, but with decentralized and distributed actual data stores. And now you can, in immediate real-time, share what you want across your tapestry of data sets with whom you want under a framework that everyone can interrogate and use. And through that, you can create personas for usage, which give you grace and ease through that complexity of terms and conditions. So we actually talked about this with Kantara Initiative at the My Data project in Helsinki just 3 weeks ago. And there are real life versions of this coming to market now. So I actually wouldn't be as negative about the future. Rather, I actually think we're seeing technology coming to market right now that's supporting it. What we don't have, though, is standardization. And that's very important. So an ISO standard in ways that all these different industries can talk and understand what means what and how it means is a critical requirement. And there are groups working on it, but it's not present yet.
And to jump in on that, I mean, one thing that's really important for us to realize here is when, like Emily brought up this idea of ownership, I think we all miss the fact that ownership doesn't mean I have it and you don't, right? I think one important thing to be thinking about, and kind of going to your point of federated, just because you have it doesn't mean it means I can have it too. And so, and on the regulatory model, we have to look at this as a world of ands, not a world of ors. And so if we start thinking about, I as an individual can have data sets about myself, you, the industry, can have data sets about me, we collectively can manage it together. And that's somewhat of what you're referring to is this federated model. And I think that's the model for success going forward, personally.
And while we're sort of looking to the future, what are your feelings, Michael, I'm going to come back to you again on this, about a future in which we use more voice assistants, we use more devices that don't have screens in them, and in a sense we assign our consent permissions to machines on our behalf that are maybe talking to the machines that are working on behalf of the brands that we're talking to. How do you feel about that kind of future scenario?
I think it's most certainly possible. It's going to be powered by solutions like what Stuart's providing, in the sense that, what people are looking for is ease and convenience and simplicity of engagement. And in order to get there, it's going to be automated. It's going to be machine-led. And I think one of the things that we'll have to look at is how can the machine represent me as the individual as opposed to industry? And you ultimately have machine-to-machine engagement, where the individual's machine will be interacting with the industry machine, and that will be happening with us on scale. Gartner predicted a while back that by 2020, 2021, 80% of every interaction a person has with the company will be automated, and roughly 10% of those interactions will be driven through voice. And one of the things that we need to learn is as we integrate these sensors into our lives, the vast majority of the connected devices and sensors that are producing the data that create value for our society don't in fact actually have screens. And so it's going to be the machines and the federated set of devices I bring into my life that will become critically important. So we're going to have to find ways to automate this.
Yeah, and Michael, I'll just quickly say that hopefully the 80-20 rule, or maybe even the 90-10 rule, will prevail. We'll be able to do about 80 or 90% of the work with semi-automated processes. And a great example is age gating is important. If I'm 21, I need access to a whole bunch of things because I'm of age majority. So I actually don't need to give people my date of birth. I just need to have a pass-fail on am I more than 365 times 21 years old, for example. So what we can do is you can create personas around your age. And I might choose to have my age persona active at all times for consent, meaning if I go anywhere, I don't mind if people know that I'm of age. Where I might have a shopping persona and I might have my waist size and I'm allergic to wool and all these other things that are relevant to a shopping. And if I enter a shopping mall or a Banana Republic, my persona activates around that. So we can create pseudonym personas around us with consent attributes attached to them that make our life 80-20 or 90-10 easy. And then when you get the fringe case where you have a major requirement that's necessary and specific and informed, then you have the pop-up. And what that means is we can reduce the fatigue and have an elegant and simplistic way to navigate through our lives using consent, enabled by AI and voice, but powered by personas where you've done groupings that can be interrogated in real time. And that is completely doable.
And what's terribly exciting about what's going forward too is, well, it's the nature of what data is. So to your point of I am of age, today, the only way to really verify I am of age is here's my governmental issued ID with my actual birth date. When solutions like yours and others in the blockchain world that come down the pike, where I've had registries where I can have the registry verify that I am over 21, I can therefore start interacting with industry, demonstrating that I am of age without it verifiably, without actually having to give my real birthday.
Exactly right.
So, and it's going to be a whole series of systems where we'll be able to exchange with data without actually giving the raw data, but the attributes for what the data is intended to mean. And I think once we get to that point, it's going to be terribly exciting and really opening up a thrilling world in front of us.
So if I may, so two points. One about how to set up sort of central consent profile. It's what we have tried to do within the TMF. So the TMF is an industry organization, initially based on telco mainly. And so what we have done is a principle of privacy, what we call privacy profile. So basically it's a representation of the permission or the consent related to each piece of information and for each party that could be involved in a usage of data. So party can be internal to the company or external as well. And this is a way to define your privacy profile. So what you want to open or what you want to do with your data, and then to modelize it and to put it in a backend so that it can be enforced later. What is also interesting is that we can imagine that if there are tools to define this privacy profile, and if the platform vendors or manufacturers use this norm, we can easily think about a scenario where you will come as a user with your privacy profile that can be contained in a personal information manager, for example, and then you send it automatically to a service provider, and it can be compared automatically with the privacy profile of the company, indicating you just the difference. And if there are incompatibility, for example, if you say that you don't want your data or your, for example, your name, first name, last name to get out of your country, and if the service is hosted in another country, it can underline this particular section. So it's only pointing on the differences between the company privacy policy and your own privacy settings, let's say. So it's a way to to make it quite easy to implement and quite simple also for the end user to understand the difference. So you don't check each time what you already agreed in terms of usage of personal data. You're just checking the difference and what is important. Just another comment regarding the chatbots and regarding Alexa and Google Home, etc. Today, there is clearly a problem of consent and a problem of authentication also in such environment. You attach your device, in fact, to an account. And in fact, all the family can access to the data of this account. There are concepts of switching users, so you can define household members, for example, and but you just have to say switch to Fabien, for example, and I would switch to another identity. So basically, you can access personal data of another person of your household, just saying a phrase, and you can also do payment, just asking for payment. So I think you have all heard about the topic on Amazon with a TV advertising or something like that, or a TV show that was explaining how to purchase a doll. And in fact, several dolls have been purchased by several people because Alexa device was next to the TV. So that's you see that it's just the beginning of the story in terms of personal assistant and home devices like that. Well,
yeah, we've all bought one of those doll houses by accident, and there's a whole world of hilarity, I think, awaiting us as voice assistants become more prevalent in people's lives. I think actually we're at the hour mark now. It really has flown by. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of this topic. I urge everybody watching to, if they haven't already, to download the free white paper from the MEF website. I'll also remind you that this conversation was recorded, and everybody who tuned in will get a link that they can click through to watch it, and they can share maybe with their social media with anyone they think might be interested. I want to thank again Stuart, Emily, Michael, and Fabien, and everybody else for joining in, and for the MEF for hosting this session. And we'll leave it there and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We appreciate it.